The year was 1941. The Pacific glimmered under a sky so clear it seemed untouched by conflict. American naval bases across Hawaii bustled with routine activity, the calm rhythm of drills, mail calls, and mess hall laughter echoing under the shadow of palm trees. Among the new arrivals at Pearl Harbor was John Best, a 22-year-old fighter pilot with a Midwestern heart and a skyward gaze. His boots still carried the dust of flight school, but his mind raced with dreams of glory and duty. As he stepped off the transport plane, he looked around in awe. Aircraft carriers stretched across the harbor like steel giants. The air buzzed with the scent of jet fuel, sea salt, and adventure. He shook hands with his commanding officer, nodded respectfully to the mechanics, and joined his squadron, men with different backgrounds but the same badge on their shoulders. The barracks were filled with letters from home, pin-up posters, and nervous laughter. No one knew what lay ahead. Thousands of miles across the ocean in the heart of Japan, Commander Akira Ishida adjusted his uniform before entering the war room. A career naval officer with quiet intelligence and sharp instincts, he'd served since the Manchurian campaign. Now in his early 40s, he bore the discipline of a soldier and the soul of a thinker. The atmosphere was tense. Maps of the Pacific lay sprawled across the table, red circles drawn around American installations. The Imperial Command had finalized a bold strategy. Pearl Harbor was to be struck without warning, a surprise attack meant to cripple the U.S. Navy before it could respond. Akira listened intently, the words of his superiors ringing with certainty. Yet, within him stirred a silence. He understood the honor of duty, but something in the planned ambush felt dishonorable. Still, he saluted and accepted his orders. His carrier division would lead the first wave. Back in Hawaii, John adjusted to life on base. He joked with his bunkmates, spent evenings walking along the beach, and flew training runs over the turquoise water. The days were peaceful, the nights full of stars. On the morning of December 7th, he found himself in the mess hall, spooning eggs onto his plate when the air outside began to rumble. Not thunder, not drills, but something deeper, metallic, and fast. Before he could react, the first explosion shattered the calm. The ground shook violently. Windows burst inward. Sirens wailed across the base. Outside, black smoke rose like a funeral pyre. Planes screamed overhead, painted with red suns. Pearl Harbor was under attack. John dropped his tray and bolted toward the hangars, dodging falling debris and the wounded. All around him, chaos unfolded. Battleships moaned under torpedo strikes. Aircraft exploded on runways before they could lift off. He reached his plane and scrambled into the cockpit with shaking hands. Nearby pilots were already airborne or dead. With a roar, he took off into the sky, heart pounding, training barely keeping pace with reality. In the air, the battle was surreal. Flames reflected in the ocean below. Japanese Zeros swarmed like hornets. John dodged tracer rounds, gunned down one enemy plane, and nearly collided with falling debris. The sky was full of fire, smoke, and screams. On board the Japanese carrier Shokaku, Akira stood on the bridge, watching the attack unfold through his binoculars. Reports came in. American ships ablaze, airfields devastated. His officers cheered quietly, but Akira remained silent. He saw the devastation, the Arizona engulfed in flames, sailors diving into oil-slicked water. For a moment he saw his own reflection in the glass, and behind his composed face doubt flickered. Was this victory, or the beginning of something far worse? John managed to land his bullet-ridden plane as fuel leaked onto the tarmac. Around him, the base was a graveyard of steel and fire. He stumbled from the cockpit, dazed, covered in ash, and looked across the harbor. The ships he'd admired just days ago now lay twisted and burning. The sun set on a day that would forever mark history, and in its fading light, John Best stood among the ruins, no longer a boy dreaming of war, but a soldier living its horror. The dawn after the attack arrived not with light, but with silence. A silence so deep it seemed the island itself mourned. Smoke still curled from the twisted wreckage of battleships now half sunk like wounded beasts, their once proud hulls scarred and blackened. The air was thick with the stench of oil, fire, and the unspoken grief of hundreds of lost lives. John Best stood at the edge of the harbor, his boots coated in ash, his uniform torn and bloodied. He watched as stretchers carried the wounded, and chaplains moved quietly from body to body, offering prayers to those beyond saving. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the overwhelming weight of what he had survived. He had always thought war would be glory. Now it was just death. The base had turned into a makeshift hospital. Tents rose in every open field, and corridors overflowed with the wounded. John's squadron, once 22 strong, had been reduced to 9. Some were missing, others confirmed dead. He sat among the survivors, silent, haunted. His commanding officer, a grizzled captain with a hollow stare, simply nodded and said, "This is only the beginning." Orders soon arrived. Reinforcements were being rushed to the Pacific, and those who could fly would return to the sky. John was promoted, more out of necessity than honor, and given command of a new flight team. The boy from Iowa, who had only days ago dreamed of adventure, was now a leader among the broken. Thousands of miles away, Akira Ishida stood aboard the returning carrier, the cheers of his men echoing across the deck. The mission had succeeded beyond expectation. Japan had delivered a devastating blow to the American Pacific Fleet, but as the celebrations unfolded, Akira found no pride in his chest. In his quarters, he unfolded a letter from his wife, still scented with the softness of home. His son had begun school. His daughter had learned to sing. Yet here he was, miles from them, writing history with steel and fire. His commanders praised him. Promotions loomed. Yet in quiet corners of his mind, a question persisted. Had they awoken? A sleeping giant? Back in America, the nation stirred. President Roosevelt addressed the country with steady fury. "A date which will live in infamy," he declared. Across cities and towns, men lined up to enlist. Factories roared to life. War bonds were sold. Flags hung in windows beside stars, blue for service, gold for sacrifice. In Hawaii, John prepared for redeployment. New orders pointed toward the Coral Sea. Intelligence suggested Japan was moving to secure key islands. The United States needed to strike back. With patched-up planes and weary hearts, John's squadron shipped out aboard the USS Yorktown. The days at sea were tense. The men trained, ate in silence, and stared at maps. They were headed into the unknown. On the Japanese side, Akira briefed his air group aboard the Zuikaku. The objective was to intercept and destroy the advancing American fleet. His pilots, young and disciplined, nodded without question. Akira recognized the same fire in their eyes that once burned in his. He saw their hunger for glory and feared for their innocence. He stood on the flight deck as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting blood-red light across the waves. He knew the Americans would not remain passive. This war would stretch longer and darker than anyone dared admit. The Battle of the Coral Sea began with scattered contact. Aircraft launched from carriers hunting shadows on the water. John soared high above the clouds, scanning the vast blue below. The first engagement came swift and brutal. His squadron dove upon a Japanese convoy, unleashing hell. Anti-air fire exploded around them. John's wingman, Parker, took a direct hit, his plane vanishing into the ocean without a sound. The scream in John's throat never escaped. He locked onto a Japanese bomber and fired, the enemy bursting into flame and spiraling down. Adrenaline masked the sorrow. There was no time to feel, only fight. Akira's fleet absorbed the hit but responded with equal force. His orders were precise, his demeanor calm. He directed waves of bombers toward the Yorktown's position. The sky turned into a storm of machines and smoke. Akira watched the reports come in. Losses on both sides. Ships burning. Seas stained with oil and blood. Neither side claimed victory, but both knew the war had escalated. This was no longer a series of isolated strikes. It had become a full-scale collision of empires. Night fell over the Pacific. Fires still burned on the water, casting flickering reflections across the waves. John lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, hearing the screams that never came during battle. He clutched a photograph of his family, his mother smiling, his father proud. He felt the weight of command, the burden of survival. He had avenged Pearl Harbor, but the emptiness inside him only deepened. In Japan, Akira sent a message home. He spoke little of the battle. Instead, he asked about the garden, about the plum blossoms blooming outside their window. He longed for quiet things, for things untouched by war. But even as he wrote, he knew the worst was yet to come. The ocean was calm, deceptively so, as both navies drifted toward their next clash. The Battle of the Coral Sea had proven the war could be fought and won from the decks of carriers, and now all eyes turned to Midway. A speck of land surrounded by endless blue, Midway held strategic weight far beyond its size. The Japanese sought to draw out and destroy what remained of the American fleet. It would be a trap, one Akira Ishida was tasked with setting. Yet Akira, now increasingly wary of overconfidence, studied his maps with caution. American resolve had been underestimated once. He would not make that mistake again. On the USS Enterprise, John Best adjusted his flight harness and listened to the new battle plan. The Navy had cracked parts of the Japanese code. They knew Midway was the target, and this time they would strike first. The crew prepared in silence, sharpening blades, checking ammunition, whispering last words into dog tags. John's squadron had been replenished with new pilots, fresh faces full of belief. He envied their innocence and feared their fate. He took one aside, a 19-year-old named Reeves, and told him plainly, "War is chaos. Stay alive by staying alert. Don't chase kills, chase survival." June 4th, 1942. The sun rose red over Midway as the first wave of Japanese aircraft bombarded the island's airfields. Explosions lit the sky, and anti-aircraft guns roared in reply. The island's defenders held on, damaged but not destroyed. The Japanese fleet pressed forward, believing the Americans were still days away. But from beyond the horizon, U.S. carriers launched their squadrons. Among them was John, leading his team into the fight. The sky filled with American torpedo bombers flying low and slow, easy prey for enemy fighters. One by one, they fell. But they distracted the Japanese long enough. High above, dive bombers descended, John among them, catching the enemy fleet exposed. Akira stood on the deck of the Akagi as the alarm sounded. The lookout screamed, "Dive bombers incoming!" He barely had time to react. Bombs fell from the sky like thunderbolts. One struck the flight deck, engulfing it in flame. Another hit the hangar, detonating fueled aircraft and igniting a chain of destruction. The Akagi was crippled. Akira ordered evacuation as fire crews struggled in vain. Around them, more carriers were hit, the Kaga, the Soryu. The Japanese fleet was reeling. What had begun as a trap for the Americans had turned into a slaughter of their own making. John pulled up sharply, watching the enemy carrier disappear under clouds of smoke. His squadron had landed the decisive blow, but at a price. Reeves, the young pilot, didn't make it back. His plane had gone down in flames. John saw it crash into the sea but could do nothing. They returned to the Enterprise battered but victorious. Cheers erupted on deck. Officers shook hands. But John only looked out over the waves, where the bodies of enemies and friends drifted alike. He had delivered death. It felt nothing like triumph. Akira was pulled from the sea, burned and shaken, his face streaked with soot and salt water. He stared at the sinking silhouette of the Akagi, the pride of the fleet, now a tomb. He had failed to predict this outcome. Intelligence had faltered. Confidence had become weakness. The Emperor's forces would no longer have the upper hand. He was promoted despite the loss, honored for bravery, not results, but the scars of defeat would follow him. He wrote a final letter from the hospital ship, unsure if he would ever return home. In the aftermath, the balance in the Pacific shifted. The Japanese Navy lost 4 of its best carriers along with hundreds of planes and irreplaceable pilots. America, though bloodied, had struck a mortal wound. John's name was noted in the after-action report, commended for leadership, valor, and composure. But he felt none of those things. He sat alone on the deck that night, stars overhead, and whispered Reeves's name into the wind. The war had just begun, but the toll was already immense. Weeks passed. The seas calmed, but the war did not. Following Midway, the United States launched a new phase, an offensive across the island chains. Their goal: push Japan back, one strip of land at a time. First came Guadalcanal, a jungle-covered battleground where every inch had to be earned in blood. John Best's squadron was assigned close air support for the Marines. Gone were the open skies of carrier battles. Now he flew, low and fast, strafing enemy positions hidden beneath dense canopy and gunfire. Every flight felt personal. He was no longer fighting symbols or fleets, he was fighting men, soldiers like himself, hiding in trees, firing back with desperation in their eyes. John flew over beaches littered with bodies, some in green, some in khaki. His missions were relentless. Drop bombs, return, refuel, reload, fly again. Between runs, he spoke with Marines, young, mud-covered, wide-eyed. They told stories of night ambushes, bayonet charges, and screams in the darkness. They talked about the enemy with respect and sometimes with fear. One Marine told John, "They don't surrender. They'd rather die in the mud than give up." John nodded. He understood. Somewhere out there, someone like Akira was still giving orders, still holding the line. Akira Ishida had returned to duty, assigned now to a ground command. He stood on the edge of a dugout position in the Solomon Islands, watching supply boats unload crates of ammunition. The air was humid, heavy with rain and rot. His men were tired but loyal. Young conscripts, engineers, even farmers turned soldiers. They built bunkers from fallen trees, slept in mosquito nets, and waited for the inevitable. Akira walked among them, offering quiet words. He carried no illusions of glory now. Their job was to delay the enemy. Every day they held was a day, one for the homeland. But he saw their eyes. He knew many would not survive. As the battle for Guadalcanal intensified, both sides suffered. The jungles became death traps, snipers, dysentery, starvation. American planes brought fire from above. Japanese artillery answered from the shadows. John's aircraft was damaged during a low pass. Shrapnel tore through the wing, forcing him into a crash landing near a Marine patrol. He emerged from the wreckage bruised and shaken, dragged to safety by infantrymen. For a week, he lived with the ground troops, eating cold rations, hearing their prayers at night. He saw their exhaustion, their courage. When he finally returned to the airstrip, something inside him had shifted. The line between pilot and soldier had blurred. They were all just men, fighting to stay alive. On the other side of the jungle, Akira's command post was overrun. American forces broke through in a nighttime assault, and the bunkers became tombs. Akira led a countercharge with bayonet in hand, his sword drawn not for honor, but for survival. He was wounded by grenade fragments, but refused evacuation. He stayed with his men, tending the dying, whispering old poems of the homeland to those who could no longer see. When ordered to retreat, he left behind 50 graves marked only by bamboo crosses. He memorized their names. By early 1943, Guadalcanal was declared secure. The U.S. had taken it, but at a cost that left many asking if victory still mattered. John returned to his carrier with hollow eyes and a silver star. He didn't care about medals. He carried a sketch given to him by a Marine child he'd met, a crayon drawing of the American flag and the words, "Come home safe." It was the first time he cried since Pearl Harbor. Akira, now stationed in New Guinea, received orders to prepare for the next wave. Supplies were low, morale lower, but he stood tall. He had become the kind of leader he once feared, quiet, relentless, and unwilling to surrender. When asked what Japan's future held, he answered simply, "We survive today. That is enough." The war pressed forward, island by island, soul by soul. By late 1943, the American momentum had become unstoppable. The doctrine of island hopping was in full swing, and each step forward brought them closer to Japan's heartland. Next came Tarawa, barely a dot on the map, yet fortified with such ferocity it became a symbol of Japan's iron defense. For John Best, now a battle-hardened squadron leader, the mission was familiar: provide air cover, soften resistance, support landings. But nothing about Tarawa was routine. The reefs shredded landing craft before they reached the shore, and Marines waded through chest-deep water under heavy machine gun fire. From above, John watched the massacre unfold, men dropping in the surf, waves turning crimson. He strafed pillboxes and radio towers, fired rockets into bunkers, but he could not stop the slaughter below. His voice cracked over the radio, demanding more support, more firepower. His wingman, Gonzalez, was shot down by flak while pulling up from a bombing run. John saw the parachute fail to open. His fists clenched on the stick, but there was no time to mourn. There was only the next target. Tarawa fell after 3 days, but those 3 days felt like eternity. Thousands of bodies lay rotting in the sun. Some corpses still clutched rifles. Others had no faces left to mourn. Victory came dressed as death. Akira Ishida had been reassigned once more, this time to Saipan. The high command recognized his endurance, his unbreakable composure under fire. He arrived to inspect fortifications and inspire the garrison, though he no longer believed in speeches. He saw the desperation in his soldiers' eyes. Supplies were short, morale thinner. Teenagers manned anti-aircraft guns. Old farmers were given rifles with rusted bolts. Yet they all saluted him. He nodded solemnly in return, offering only presents. Akira spent his nights in the command cave overlooking the sea, wondering how many more islands would fall before the homeland stood alone. By mid-1944, the Mariana Islands became the next battleground. Saipan, Guam, and Tinian were vital for airfields, launch pads to strike Japan itself. The U.S. fleet, now massive and roaring with industrial might, closed in. John's aircraft carrier joined the armada. The skies were filled with Hellcats, and Avengers, their engines howling like thunder across the water. John no longer flinched at launch. He was used to the shaking deck, the sharp descent, the explosions below. But this time, he felt a weight. The closer they came to Japan, the more real the end began to feel. Saipan was a nightmare. Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture them. John watched helplessly, from the air, unable to stop the bodies from falling. The Marines on the ground called it the Banzai Cliff. They said the screams never stopped, even after nightfall. John's missions grew darker. He bombed caves. He napalmed forests. He called in coordinates that turned villages to ash, and each night he sat alone in the mess hall staring into black coffee, asking himself if they were still the good guys. Akira refused evacuation when the final assault came. American forces poured in with overwhelming firepower. Akira's men held for as long as they could, until ammo ran out, until food turned to weeds, until blood replaced water. When a final order came from Tokyo, fight to the death, he gathered the last of his officers. Some were injured, some were crying. He offered no speeches, only silence and a nod. Then they charged. A final, desperate Banzai charge, outnumbered, 10-1. John's squadron circled above, called in to defend the perimeter. He saw the charge, hundreds running across open ground with bayonets and tattered flags. He didn't fire. He just watched, unable to lift his hand. By the end of the battle, the island was silent. Japanese resistance was gone. The dead lay in heaps, some still clutching swords, others blown apart beyond recognition. Akira's body was never officially recovered. Some said he fell leading the charge. Others claimed he vanished into the jungle to die alone. John flew his final sortie over Saipan at sunset, the sky streaked with blood-red light. The island burned beneath him. And still, the war moved on. The capture of Saipan changed everything. With new airfields carved into the scorched land, The B-29 superfortresses began to rise. Long-range bombers capable of reaching the Japanese mainland, this was no longer island warfare. This was the prelude to the final act. John Best's unit was reassigned to escort duty, flying cover for bombers en route to Tokyo. The days of dogfighting over palm trees were over. Now he flew at 30,000 feet, above clouds, above life, guiding waves of metal birds that carried death in their bellies. Below, the enemy could barely see them. But when the bombs fell, entire cities lit up like lanterns on a festival night. Only the screams that followed were not songs of celebration, but mourning. John watched Tokyo burn from the cockpit of his Mustang, the glow so bright it reached the stars. He didn't feel triumph. He felt sick. The firebombing raids devoured neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, everything. It was no longer about targeting factories. Now the goal was to break morale. The military called it necessity. The pilots called it strategy. But in the silence of the return flights, John called it what it felt like, a punishment on civilians who never chose this war. He looked down and saw flames crawling through a city of wood and paper, and he wondered if someone like Akira still lived down there, still fighting, still surviving, still regretting everything. But Akira Ishida had survived Saipan. Wounded, presumed dead, he was found weeks later by a retreating scout patrol. Barely conscious, he was smuggled to Okinawa, now transformed into a fortress island. The Empire needed every veteran it had. Akira recovered slowly in a cave hospital, the air thick with blood and salt. When he was strong enough to stand, he was given a new command: lead the coastal defense of Okinawa against the inevitable. He accepted, though his eyes no longer carried belief. They carried duty. Okinawa was the last shield before the Japanese homeland. If it fell, nothing remained between the Americans and Tokyo. Akira walked the cliffside bunkers, watching children dig trenches, mothers carry ammunition. There was no army left, only survivors. When the Americans arrived in April 1945, they brought everything: ships, tanks, artillery, planes. The assault began with a roar that shook the island's bones. John flew overhead, tasked with clearing anti-air positions. But from above, it felt like erasing an island from the map. Explosions thundered across the hills. The sea was black, with naval vessels, each one spitting fire. The ground forces advanced slowly, methodically, step by bloody step. Okinawa became a graveyard. Civilians huddled in caves. Japanese soldiers launched suicide charges. Kamikaze pilots flew into carriers screaming "Tenno Heika Banzai" before disappearing in balls of flame. John's plane was nearly hit by a kamikaze attack on the USS Bunker Hill. He watched as a Zero slammed into the deck, sending shrapnel and men flying into the sea. The fire raged for hours. That night, John sat in the carrier chapel, helmet in his lap, praying not for victory, but for the madness to end. He had long since stopped believing that any side would win. There was only survival. There was only loss. Akira led his final stand from the southern cliffs of Okinawa. His men, wounded, starving, many without ammunition, fought with bayonets, rocks, their bare hands. When the order came to retreat, he refused. When the order came to surrender, he said nothing. His final entry in his worn notebook read, "For my children I stand, for my emperor I endure, for peace I die." On June 22nd, Okinawa fell. Akira was not found among the prisoners. His cave had collapsed under bombardment. No body, no flag, only silence. The battle had lasted nearly 3 months. Over 200,000 lives were lost, half of them civilians. John flew his final mission over Okinawa on a day when the sea was calm and the skies unusually clear. No bullets, no flak, just the long, slow flight over a shattered island that once held green fields and cherry blossoms. He didn't fire a single shot. There was nothing left to shoot. The war, it seemed, had devoured everything. By summer 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard of fleets, islands, and lives. The Allied forces had conquered territory after territory, but with each victory, the resistance grew more desperate. Intelligence warned that an invasion of Japan itself would cost millions of lives on both sides. But far from the battlefield in the deserts of New Mexico, a different kind of weapon had been born. One that would end the war not with battles but with a single blinding moment. John Best didn't know what was coming. No pilot did. They were told only to stand by, wait for orders that would either send them into the heart of Japan or end the war before they even took off. On August 6th, the sky above Hiroshima was clear. At 8:15 a.m., a lone B-29, Enola Gay, dropped its payload. John was thousands of miles away, pacing the hangar deck, reading letters from home, trying not to think about the possibility of storming Tokyo's beaches. When the report came through, it wasn't loud. It was whispered. A single bomb. One city. Gone. Hiroshima had vanished beneath a mushroom cloud, and the world had changed in 9 seconds. There was no cheering on John's ship, only stunned silence. The radio operators wept. The engineers refused to speak. Even the commanders looked pale beneath their caps. No one truly understood what had just happened, only that something irreversible had begun. 3 days later, another bomb fell, this time on Nagasaki. Another city turned to ash. And then, the silence deepened. Japan did not retaliate. No final banzai charge, no kamikaze wave. Just silence. Then at last, the Emperor's voice crackled over Japanese airwaves, unheard by the public until now. His words were restrained, formal, but beneath them was the ghost of defeat. Japan would surrender. For the first time in its modern history, it would bow. John was in the cockpit when the news was officially confirmed. He had been preparing for a strike mission, engine warming, when the ground crew ran toward him waving. "It's over," they shouted. "It's done." He turned off the ignition. He sat in the quiet hum of the cockpit, helmet on his lap, and breathed the heaviest sigh of his life. There were no tears, just an overwhelming emptiness. After everything, Pearl Harbor, Midway, Saipan, Okinawa, it was over. But he didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a man who had outlived something no one should witness. In Tokyo, the streets were filled with stunned civilians. Many refused to believe the war had ended. They had been told surrender was worse than death. Akira Ishida, now a broken man recovering in the ruins of Nagasaki, watched the blackened skyline from a hospital window. The blast had burned part of his face. He had survived by luck, or fate, or some twisted mercy of war. He had no more orders to give, no more troops to lead, only the echo of a vanished empire in his heart. A nurse handed him a newspaper. The headline read only, "Surrender." He folded it silently, not in anger, not in sorrow, in acceptance. The war had taken everything but his soul. The American occupation began swiftly. Planes dropped leaflets instead of bombs. Ships brought food instead of fire. John Best was among the first pilots to fly over a peaceful Tokyo. He saw no anti-aircraft fire, no enemy planes, just a quiet, defeated city, scarred by bombs, humbled by history. He didn't recognize it. It wasn't the Japan he had imagined. It was just another place full of people trying to survive. He asked permission to leave a note at the memorial for Hiroshima's dead, a simple message written on his flight map. "I was a soldier. I did what I was told, but I will never forget." He placed it beneath a scorched tree that still stood, leafless, twisted, alive. The war had ended, but for John and Akira, the battle inside was just beginning. The flags were raised, the treaties signed, the war was over, officially. But peace, John Best quickly realized, was just a word. The noise of battle had been replaced by a new kind of silence, one where the dead no longer screamed, but still lived in every shadow, every memory, every name carved into stone. John stood aboard the USS Missouri, stationed nearby during the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay. He watched from the deck of a secondary cruiser, binoculars in hand, observing the stiff gestures, the exchanged papers, the tension behind forced diplomacy. It was history unfolding, but it felt hollow. There was no celebration, no victory parade in the sky. Just tired faces, cracked hands, and hollow eyes. Soldiers from both sides watched each other like ghosts. No hatred now, only the weight of everything they had done to each other. John remained in the Pacific during the early weeks of the occupation. He flew reconnaissance, humanitarian drops, and supply escorts over cities he had once bombed. His plane no longer carried weapons, just crates of rice, medicine, water. In Okinawa, he saw children barefoot among the rubble, chasing after parachutes that carried candy rations. In Tokyo, he watched crowds quietly rebuild homes with broken wood and salvaged bricks. He visited a school that had reopened in a temple, no desks, just mats on the floor, and a teacher using chalk on the wall. He helped unload boxes of notebooks and pencils, and a young boy bowed deeply, placing a paper crane in his palm. John didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Akira Ishida had been placed under medical review, not arrest. His burns had healed, but the scars beneath them had not. He walked through Nagasaki with a cane, his uniform stripped of insignia. He was not shamed by defeat, but haunted by survival. His family home had been destroyed. His wife and children had evacuated weeks before the bombing, but he had no news of them yet. Each day he waited for a letter that never came. When he was offered transport to Tokyo for official debriefing, he declined. "I will walk," he said. And he did. Mile by mile, through villages reduced to ash, through valleys where rivers ran black with soot, through towns where silence replaced song. Along the way, some recognized him, a few bowed, some turned away. He neither blamed nor explained. He simply walked. John eventually returned home to America. The train station was filled with waving families, banners, and a brass band. But he stepped off into a world that felt unfamiliar. He expected joy, but found confusion. People asked about his kills, about the enemy, about glory. He had no answers, just dreams full of fire and faces he couldn't forget. He struggled to sleep. He flinched at loud noises. He drank more than he should. He stared at the Pacific on maps like it was a graveyard he couldn't visit. When asked to speak at his town's veterans gathering, he read a single line. "I fought, I survived, and I grieve." Then he walked away. In Japan, Akira eventually reached Tokyo. His hair had turned white along the journey. He wore civilian clothes and carried a satchel with only 2 items. His daughter's doll, singed but intact, and his final war journal, its pages soaked by rain. He found his home street in ruins, but a neighbor recognized him and gave him news. His family had survived. His wife was in Kyoto, his children safe with her. Akira didn't cry. He simply whispered, "Arigato." For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope, not for the return of the empire, but for the return of a life worth living. John and Akira would never meet. They would never speak, never exchange letters. But years later, they would both walk through Hiroshima, separately, quietly. John would leave a folded photograph of his squadron at the Peace Memorial. Akira would bow before the same monument, placing the doll at its base. In different tongues, they would pray for the same thing, forgiveness. Years passed. The world moved forward. Skyscrapers rose where fire once fell. Children laughed in the streets where bodies had once lain. Nations rebuilt, treaties strengthened, and the Pacific, once a theater of steel and blood, returned to being a sea of trade and tides. But for those who had fought, the war never truly ended. It lived beneath the surface of ordinary life, like a scar just under the skin. John Best, now older, with lines on his face shaped by wind, grief, and time, became a flight instructor in Texas. He trained new pilots not for war but for exploration, for science, for peace. He never spoke of the Pacific. When asked, he would only say, "I flew. Others didn't come home." That's all you need to know. But sometimes, alone in the hangar, he would open a box. Inside were fragments of a past too heavy to display. A melted dog tag, a photograph from Saipan, a child's drawing from Okinawa. And at the bottom a map of Japan, creased, faded, on which he had once scribbled the word mercy across Tokyo in pencil. He never erased it. Akira Ishida lived a quiet life in Kyoto. He became a gardener tending a small temple's grounds in the northern hills. Visitors often mistook him for a monk. He never corrected them. He never wore a uniform again. But every morning, he bowed to the east, whispered the names of the men he had lost, and offered water to a stone he had carved himself. A small, faceless statue wrapped in a child's scarf. His children grew up safe. They asked questions when they were older, and he answered truthfully. I served, I believed, I was wrong, and I survived. That, he told them, was enough burden for one lifetime. In 1965, an international peace ceremony was held in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor. Veterans from both sides were invited. Many declined. Some came. John stood at the edge of the harbor, now clean, quiet, the water still. He watched the sun rise, the same sun that had shone on the day it all began. He thought of Parker, of Reeves, of the voices he still heard when the wind howled through the cockpit. He closed his eyes, placed a hand on the rusting hull of the USS Arizona Memorial, and said nothing. Words had long since lost their power. Half a world away, Akira walked the shores of Nagasaki. He carried a box of seedlings. He planted one tree. Near the coastline, a cherry blossom. He had done this every year since the surrender. He believed that if enough of them bloomed, the world might remember beauty more than fire. A boy helped him dig the soil. Akira smiled, said thank you, and handed the child a photograph from his journal, a picture of the temple garden filled with light. The child asked what the war was like. Akira replied, it was a lesson, one the world must never forget. Decades would pass. The Pacific would host summits, not battles. John would pass away in his sleep, an old man beneath a quilt stitched with pilot wings and peace doves. Akira would live to see the millennium, his final journal entry reading, I once served war. I now serve memory. Their names would never be linked in history books, but in the hearts of those they touched, and in the silence of the skies they once ruled, they remained. John, the pilot who carried mercy, and Akira, the soldier who buried his sword in the earth. And across the vast ocean they once bled for, the waves rolled on, peaceful, endless, and free.